Alright, we finally get to chapter 29, Wilsonian Progressivism at Home and Abroad, 1912 to 1916. So it took us a long way, but we finally got to chapter 29. If you're listening to this in order, well, this makes no sense to you. For the other guys from 2014, we're jumping back and forth a little bit. So here we go. We start actually with Theodore Roosevelt, the bull moose. Remember, he hands off the presidency to his handpicked successor Taft, right? And he goes off to Africa to go shoot rhinos and elephants and stuff. And then he has a split, right? A tiff with Taft. And as a result of this, he comes back and he wants to, you know, become the Republican candidate again in 1912. Well, Taft is unwilling to give it up, and some of the old guard Republicans are unwilling to give it up also. So Roosevelt forms his own party, the Progressive Bull Moose Party, because he claimed he was as strong as a bull moose. Taft wins the Republican nomination, and the Democrats nominate some nerdy professor dude by the name of Woodrow Wilson. As almost always, well, not almost, as always happens, whenever there's a third party candidate, whoever ideologically he's closest to, he steals away their votes, and the two guys then end up ensuring that the guy that they hate the most becomes president. And that's what happens here with the election of Woodrow Wilson in 1912. So we're going to talk about the platforms of Roosevelt and Wilson. And they're the platforms of the progressive wing, I guess, of the Republican Party and then the Democrat Party. And you're going to see how odd it sounds in 1912 compared to 2014. So Roosevelt's new nationalism platform. Remember, at the end of the day, he's a Republican. Called for consolidation of trusts and labor unions. So basically more monopolies and larger conglomerations of labor unions. And they would be kept in check by the powerful growth of even larger, more numerous regulatory agencies. So this is the big stick, right? Where Theodore Roosevelt believed in good trusts that accepted regulation and bad trusts that didn't. He also was in favor of women's suffrage, minimum wage laws, and social insurance laws. He wanted to implement a social welfare state. Woodrow Wilson, on the other hand, called his platform the New Freedom. He favored small enterprise, so no trusts, unregulated markets, so the government would not regulate the marketplace. He was against social welfare proposals, and he wanted to keep trusts from forming by very, very vigorous enforcement of the antitrust laws. So he was actually against the social welfare system. So here you have a Republican, although he goes by the name of Bull Moose, Progressive Party, in favor of social welfare legislation where the government inserts itself into the lives of individuals, going against a Democrat who's against all this. So figure that one out. And then here you get the two graphics from your book. You got the elephant, which is the GOP, divided by the bull moose with the Theodore Roosevelt spectacles. And if you divide the two of those, you're dividing the vote. And along comes Woodrow Wilson, the ass. I mean, riding on the ass into the White House. And you can see there the election of 1912 shows the split of the vote. Blue is Wilson, tan is Roosevelt, and the reddish is Taft, and then the guy, or our favorite socialist, Eugene V. Debs, he's in the yellow. And you can see that Woodrow Wilson is actually a minority candidate. He only wins 41.9% of the popular vote. Here in America, we don't have runoff elections. We have something called a plurality election. So whoever wins the most votes, as long as they have the majority of the electoral vote, they win, even if they don't win a majority of the popular vote. So what's Woodrow Wilson's first thing that he does upon taking office? He goes about attacking the tariff, really changing the way the federal government obtains funds. And so with the passage of the Underwood Tariff, it substantially reduced rates, so it made foreign goods much cheaper. It also reduced the revenue that the government was receiving. So in order to make up for this, they passed the 16th Amendment, which creates a graduated income tax. Graduated income tax meaning poor people don't have to pay anything, the middle class have to pay a little bit, and the rich have to pay a higher percentage. So by 1917, so 5 years into the Woodrow Wilson administration, revenue from that's a typo, from the income tax actually exceeded the revenue generated from the tariff. And you got to remember, before this, the only way that the government made money was through customs duties, which are tariffs, and through the sale of land. And this changes in 1917, and it's primarily through income taxes since then. Nowadays, they get some money through income taxes, and then they also borrow a ton of money, both domestically and internationally, from our Chinese brothers. Wilson battles the bankers. We talked a lot about this before, right? The passage of the Federal Reserve Act 1913, it creates the Federal Reserve Board, and look, this is kind of public and kind of not, right? The president appoints the Federal Reserve Board, and they're in charge of essentially the third bank of the United States. But it's set up differently, right? It's a system, a nationwide system of they split up the country into 12 districts, and each district really has its own central bank. These regional banks are not owned by the federal government; they're actually owned by their member banks. And so each of the banks, in order to be part of the Federal Reserve System, they purchase stock in the Federal Reserve. Then this Federal Reserve is given the power to issue paper money. What is it backed by? It's not really backed by gold anymore. It's backed by commercial paper, meaning the loans that are made and obtained throughout domestic and foreign purchases. So really, our value of our dollar is based off of other people's loans, if that makes sense. And what this does is you can increase the money supply by increasing loans, or decrease the money supply by calling in those loans very, very quickly, which makes the money supply much more elastic. Remember, that's been an issue for several chapters now. We were in a currency crunch. Really, even to colonial days, we were under a currency crunch. Not so anymore. The president tames the trusts. Remember, Woodrow Wilson wanted to vigorously attack the trusts, right? And so there's the creation of the Federal Trade Commission in 1914. This is also presidentially appointed, and they're the police, right? They investigate industries that are engaged in interstate commerce to make sure that what they're doing is legit. Probably, well, there's a very big law here, the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. Remember when we talked about the Sherman Antitrust Act, that it was meant if there was a group that was in restraint of trade, that was supposed to be illegal. And they passed it with the idea to stop these big trusts, right, during the Gilded Age. But because there were so many loopholes, because lobbyists and the senators were stockholders of these trusts, instead of being used to attack monopolies, it was actually used to attack labor. A group of people who went on strike, they're in restraint of trade, so they would be attacked under the Sherman Antitrust Act. Well, the Clayton Antitrust Act fixes many of these loopholes, and it benefits labor by explicitly exempting them from antitrust prosecution and legalizing strikes and picketing. Samuel Gompers, right? You remember him? He called this act the Magna Carta of labor. Now, this picture is from your book, and I put there the title Wilson Lies in regards to foreign diplomacy. Even your book treats Woodrow Wilson too nice, right? In my opinion, he's one of the worst presidents of all time. He was a huge racist. He just flat out lies about World War I and us as far as motives. And then he claimed when he was a candidate and even as a president that he was getting rid of the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. He's getting rid of dollar diplomacy. He wanted to treat the countries in the Western Hemisphere as peers and acknowledge their various fledgling democracies. And he was going to stay out of their internal affairs. Pick a country and look to see what Woodrow Wilson did during his administration. He sent the troops into virtually every single country over and over and over again, and it was always because of this Roosevelt corollary dollar diplomacy stuff. So, I mean, he's the biggest liar around. All right, World War I. Just a small little topic there. This isn't a world history class, so I'm not going to go into too much of the causes of it with the Black Hand and Gavrilo Princip and Archduke Franz Ferdinand and all that stuff. But what you got to know is that World War I starts in the summer of 1914. And on one side, you have the Central Powers, and they are comprised of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Turkey, and Bulgaria, and Italy, actually. And on the other side, you have the Allies, the Triple Entente, France, Britain, and Russia. And of course, America proclaims its neutrality, is very, very thankful we have this huge ocean between us. We don't have to worry about them, and we start doing business with both sides, right? Because America loves its money. J.P. Morgan, his bank, actually loaned the Allies $2.3 billion. We're also building munitions for both sides. We're feeding both sides. It was a great time to be a farmer in America because all of those soldiers in Europe, they need to eat. Because we tended to do more business with Britain, and because Britain had a greater navy and was kind of blockading German ports, very quickly in the war, within a year, year and a half or so, it becomes apparent that we're doing most of our business with Britain and not a whole lot with the Central Powers anymore. And so Germany doesn't like this. And so it announces that it's going to engage in submarine warfare around the British Isles to try and first off knock down the dominance of the British Navy, but also to stop the supplies that we're sending Britain because it's keeping them in the war basically. Woodrow Wilson, of course, warns Germany that it would be held to quote unquote strict accountability for any attacks on American vessels or citizens. And this is kind of weird because the submarine is such a new development at this time period. Prior to the submarine, the rules of naval warfare was basically a ship would catch another ship and force it to stop by maybe a shot across the bow, and they actually load, like people would climb onto the other ship and then seize it. Whereas you're not going to have that with a submarine. Submarine, for the most part, just shoots a torpedo and asks questions later. So we get to the Lusitania, the sinking of the Lusitania. It was actually a British passenger liner, and it was torpedoed and sank on May 7th, 1915. Almost 1,200 people died, including 128 Americans. It was, let's be very clear here, a lot of the cargo that it was carrying, in addition to the people, I think there were bullets that were manufactured in America and being sold into Great Britain. And also, and this is straight from your book here on the right, this ad, it's an ad for the Lusitania, but then right underneath it, Germany is being very clear that, look, travel at your own risk. We're going to, try and destroy British ships that are aiding the war effort. So, to a certain extent, they did warn America this was going to happen. Nonetheless, there's a big publicity nightmare for the Germans, and from the aftermath of this, because there is innocent women and children and stuff like that, and so they agree not to sink unarmed ships and they agreed not to sink unarmed and unresisting passenger ships without warning, and this solidifies into what's called the Sussex Pledge after the sinking of a French ship called the Sussex. Here you can see what the United States looks like during World War I as far as the demographics of our own country. And, this is after we've had that huge wave of immigration right around 1890 to World War I or so. And you can see we have a huge population that are kind of on both sides of this war, right? I mean, there's millions of Americans of German and Austrian descent, and there's millions of Americans from Great Britain, Russian, and Italian descent as well. So it was we really tried to stay neutral, and it was kind of a tense time where, you didn't really come right out and say, yeah, go Germany, because, your neighbors might be Russian or Italians or something like that. This also shows you the amount of money and the trade that we're doing with both sides. Right? We're doing business with both groups, antagonistic groups here. In 1914, you can see we're doing a ton of business with Germany. It's not quite as much as Britain, but it's a massive amount, right? then you can see that once Britain kind of solidifies its control of the high seas and starts blockading German ports, that goes way down. You can see by 1916, where it's a very, very tiny fraction of British trade. This is a picture from your book. It shows you the German submarine war zone around the United Kingdom there. You can see that star there. That is where the Lusitania was sunk. So this wasn't like in New York Harbor or anything like that. Here is the election results of 1916. Woodrow Wilson, his main campaign in the summer of 1916 was that the quote, he kept us out of war. Like, oh, this Woodrow Wilson, all the Europe's on fire, and he kept us out of war. And you're going to see in the next chapter that almost immediately after the election, when Woodrow Wilson is reelected, we go to war, right? And he asks Congress to declare war. So yet another shady thing, in my opinion, that Woodrow Wilson did. You can see how close this election is, too, despite all of the major laws that were passed during the Woodrow Wilson administration. And a very, very quick lecture today, huh? The last slide, you got Wilson defeats Taft in 1912. You get the Underwood Tariff in 1913, the 16th Amendment 1913, the Federal Reserve Act 1913, Clayton Antitrust Act 1914. These are massive progressive era legislation here, and they're tested very, very heavily on. So make sure that you memorize those laws and are able to spot those, especially in a multiple choice exam. World War I begins in 1914. You get the sinking of Lusitania in 1915. The Sussex Pledge, 1916, and then you got a bunch of other progressive era laws that aren't covered very heavily, so I didn't talk about them too much, and that is it.